Wyman. I'm Robert Litvak, the Center's Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies. I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting, another in our ongoing series with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. This Non-Proliferation Forum is a monthly series of meetings that creates opportunities for cutting-edge research to be presented to and discussed before a knowledgeable Washington audience. And today, it's a pleasure to welcome back Thomas Rid, who is a former public policy scholar who has a book that's received a great deal of attention, deservedly so. But I will leave it to my co-chair, Dr. Joseph Pilat of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, to introduce our speaker. Delighted that the Wilson Center has enjoyed such a long-standing institutional collaboration with the lab, and today's meeting is another data point in that ongoing relationship. So, Joe, over to you.
Thank you, Rob. Let me offer a welcome from the Los Alamos National Laboratory and from me personally. At a time of reports of Chinese, Russian, Iranian, and other cyber activity, cybersecurity is increasingly central to U.S. national security and a focus of the U.S. national security debate, although the issue goes well beyond U.S. borders. The 2010 National Security Strategy paper stated, quote, "Cybersecurity threats represent one of the most serious national security, public safety, and economic challenges we face as a nation," end quote. Congressional hearings, National Academy studies, Pentagon strategy documents, and other studies and activities all attest to the increasing prominence of this issue, at least in the United States, as has interest in the Pentagon in cross-domain deterrence involving nuclear, space, and cyber activities. Cyber espionage to access sensitive or classified diplomatic, military, and economic information has been seen by many to be a clear and present danger that has the potential to and is eroding U.S. economic competitiveness as well as U.S. national security. But what are the implications of cyber espionage? What are the prospects for cyber attacks on critical infrastructure with potential for massive disruptions and other serious consequences? What are the prospects of cyber war? To address some of these issues, we're very fortunate to have today with us the author of Cyber War Will Not Take Place, Thomas Rid. Dr. Thomas Rid is a reader in war studies at King's College London. In 2009-2010, he was visiting scholar at Hebrew University and the Shalom Center in Jerusalem. From 2006 to 2009, he worked at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, the RAND Corporation in Washington, and at IFRI, the Institut Français des Relations Internationales. He was also a public policy scholar here, as Rob mentioned. He worked as well as the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Berlin, and he holds a PhD from Humboldt University in Berlin. Thomas.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the very kind introduction. I'll speak for about 30 minutes, maybe slightly longer, but not much more, and then we'll have a Q&A. And I'll give you a slightly condensed version of my argument today, because you can read the detailed argument in the book. And I'll talk about something that is not in the book in some more detail. We'll come to that in a moment. So you are all familiar, I suppose, with the kind of media coverage that cyber security, cyber war is receiving still. There's a degree of overstatement involved. So a lot of people speak of cyber war. And when they do so, they speak about a metaphor. A metaphor as in the war on drugs, the war on cancer. Because let's remember, nobody has ever been killed or injured as a result of a computer breach. The only physically violent computer breach that we've seen was the Stuxnet attack in against Iran's nuclear enrichment program in Natanz. That insider threats are a slightly separate problem, so I'm excluding them from that statistic. The only proper external computer attack that was violent was the Stuxnet attack. So we're talking about a metaphor, but we're also talking about the real thing, right? Cyber war can mean both the metaphor of cyber war and possible computer attacks of military or, shall we say, strategic significance. And the purpose of my book, and let's remember I work in the Department of War Studies, and the person next door may be working on the Battle of the Somme or the Six-Day War, very serious military way stations of military history, costly battles and episodes. So if we talk about cyber war, and we actually are talking about the real thing, we owe it to those who have experienced the real thing to actually be serious. So the book is trying to do that. The book is trying to peel away the metaphor from serious military or strategically relevant computer breaches. To do that, I'm briefly discussing the question in the book what war is and what criteria acts of war basically have to meet, or the use of force has to meet. Briefly, they have to be violent, instrumental, and political. Political in the sense that somebody has to take credit for these attacks. And if you apply those three criteria, violent, instrumental, and taking credit, politically taking credit for them, to the cyber attacks that we've seen so far on the record, then almost none meets those criteria. So it's not really war in most cases, but something else. So what is it if it's not war? That's the starting point of the argument. Well, first of all, it's really most of the time non-violent. There's less violence as a result of cyber attacks, not more violence. And that applies in all three major sets of computer breaches that we've seen. One is, and I'm going to apply this idea now that we're seeing less violence and less physical risk as a result of new technologies to three different problems. The first is sabotage. Computer attacks can be used to sabotage a target. They can, secondly, be used to spy on a target, to exfiltrate information for commercial gain or political benefit or whatever. So first sabotage, second espionage, and finally there's subversion, that is using new technologies to undermine established authority, help militants organize, help subversives organize. In all three areas, we're seeing less, in a way, it's easier to distinguish between violence and non-violence than in the past. That is the key novelty, I think, that we're talking about. So I'll give you a very quick example on sabotage. Some of you in the room here may remember the 2012 attack against Saudi Aramco, the computer attack against Saudi Aramco, the Saudi oil company. And it's known as Shamoon because the malware was called Shamoon in that example. It's an interesting example because what happened is 30,000 of the company's workstations, desktop computers, were disabled by the attack. Technically, it's technically not exactly correct that the data were deleted, but in effect they were deleted. So the computers were not bootable anymore. 75% of all of the company's computers unusable. I mean, you can imagine how significant that is for any company. What is interesting about the attack? Two things are very interesting about the Saudi Aramco case. First, it was not successful. The attackers tried to access the control system networks, the networks that controlled the oil production, which is technically a different layer from the desktop and computer office environment. And they did not succeed in doing so. The oil production was not affected. The second remarkable thing about the attack is that it was non-violent, yet it was extremely efficient. It was highly damaging for the company, although it was entirely non-violent. Nothing was physically destroyed, only data. And if you think about this for a moment in historical perspective, Sabotaging equipment in a military context, or really in a labor confrontation context, like in the early 20th century and late 19th century, it was kind of hard to distinguish between using violence against property or not using violence. For instance, throwing sand into a machine, or a monkey wrench, as the American expression has it, would damage the machine. Today you can achieve the same effect without damaging the machine just by withdrawing it, sabotaging it through a computer attack. So the thrust of my argument is basically to say, let's not stare at this notion of war and violence all the time, but let's move on and discuss these problems on their own merits and counter them on their own merits. And that also applies to intelligence operations. Of course, intelligence, if we may have some people here in the audience who have a background in intelligence, and of course intelligence agencies don't really like to use the word espionage when they talk about themselves. Espionage is what the other side is doing. But really espionage is the second major problem when we talk about cybersecurity. Let's quickly talk about numbers. Sabotage operations that have the goal of damaging a process or making it less efficient. The sabotage operations are very rare, especially the very serious ones. We're talking about a very small number. Depending a bit on what you include, we're talking about 2 digits, maybe even single digits. But espionage, intelligence operations that uses this new technology, here we're talking of very large numbers. In fact, we don't exactly know how large the numbers are because companies don't want to reveal when they're breached. Governments don't want to reveal when they're breached. Sometimes individuals don't even want to reveal when they're breached. And they can do that, not revealing that they're breached, because they may not even know it themselves. If your company or your government agency was breached, somebody is just copying information out. It's not like taking the copy of my book that's lying in front of you and stealing it. It's making a copy of that book, leaving that copy on the table and stealing the information that you have just copied. And of course that can be done entirely clandestinely. So the problem here is massive. It's big. It's huge. And I think we are discovering how huge this problem is as a result of the Snowden leaks as well, as a result of the intelligence revelations that are coming out, drip, drip, over the past couple of weeks and months. Now, I would like to take this opportunity here, and I haven't done this before in other book talks, to talk a little bit more about this leak, about the revelations, the intelligence revelations. To prepare for this book talk, to prepare for this book tour in Washington and New York City next week, I met a number of senior officials in government and also in the intelligence community in the UK before I left, and this week also here in Washington, just because as you do, you have some conversations on the side to be able to write the next interesting book with some interesting first-hand accounts. And the more conversations I had, the more concerned I became, because partly as a result of the Syria situation, which crowds out everything else out of the news, we are not having a discussion about the Snowden revelations and about the leaks. We have new revelations all the time, and we discover something like the NSA is able to crack advanced encryption. Okay, the GCHQ cooperates with the Israeli intelligence services. Okay, maybe that's even too expected. So we have these new revelations, but nobody in government, and in my view also nobody in the public, intellectuals, people like you in this room, are really discussing what this all means. So what do the leaks and the revelations actually mean? Let's consider that question for a short moment. One of the quotes that I heard last week was, "This is our cyber 9/11," from an insider. This is our cyber 9/11. We just imagined it differently. Now, the concern inside the intelligence community about the damage that this is doing is very significant. And I think many people outside the intelligence community have a difficulty grasping and appreciating the amount of damage that is being done. Why is that the case? Because successful intelligence work is invisible. Once it fails, it's very visible. Now, I'm not trying to give you the impression here that there's no problem, that everything the NSA or the GCHQ or other intelligence agencies are doing, that this is okay and should continue as it does. In fact, if you talk to people on the inside, they don't see it this way either. But the problem that governments are facing today is that they don't want to be seen as reacting on the Guardian's and Glenn Greenwald's terms. They want to react on their own terms and on their own timing. Now, is that a good decision? I'm not sure it is a good decision, because the fire is burning and it's very destructive, and they are concerned about stoking that fire by reacting very publicly. But the fire is burning. Something needs to be done. So let me briefly consider the costs and the benefits here of this affair, and then conclude. So the benefits first. The affair, this entire situation is revealing something rather interesting about America, really. And I've only fully understood that because I'm not here anymore. I used to live here for 3 years, and then now I'm in the UK, obviously. Is Snowden an outlier? Is Snowden an individual? I would not call him a traitor, perhaps not even a criminal, but is he an individual who stands on his own, or is he standing for something bigger? Is he standing for a narrative, perhaps an ideology, just something bigger, something deeper? I asked that question to a number of people in interesting positions. And the response that I received here in Washington was always the same. The response was, yes, of course, he stands for something bigger. They don't say that publicly, of course. But what does it mean? What does he stand for? Both on the extreme, or shall we say on the on the far right in the United States and on the far left on the United States, you have very strong, as you all know, very strong libertarian civil liberty reflexes, which is part of American political culture. It's part of the values that are enshrined in the Constitution itself. Now, I think it is not an overstatement to say that Snowden is perhaps just an extreme articulation of those values. And that is also why the resonance in the wider public is also so supportive of him. I mean, not all people are supportive, but you have a very polarized situation here. Some people react in extreme ways against Snowden's revelation, and others call him a hero. So the hero versus traitor narrative is quite powerful, I find. I'm quite stunned by how powerful it is. But of course, he's neither of the two. He's neither a hero, nor is he just a traitor. And the challenge here, and it's a really difficult challenge. I published an article in Slate a couple of days ago that tried to aim for the middle and look at the benefits of the affair, like starting a public debate, and the costs, like damaging intelligence operations, in detail. And the reaction to this article was vicious. I was accused of all sorts of things that you better don't want to imagine. And I thought I made actually a nuanced approach. So it's actually really difficult to do that. Maybe I was just not shrewd enough in how I did it, but nevertheless, even if I didn't do a good job, read the article, the reaction was stunning online. Now, what does that mean? What are the conclusions from this? I think the conclusions are that something ultimately has to change. I think the government is people inside government are understanding this, and people inside the intelligence community are also understanding this. And to a degree, I'm surprised by this. But the interesting question that has to be debated is what needs to change. There is no doubt that a democracy needs security. There's also no doubt that a democracy needs privacy. And you know the arguments. This is a philosophical and political theoretical debate with immediate practical consequences. I don't see that debate happening. I think intellectuals like many of you here around, I see many familiar faces who publish a lot, have responsibility to participate in this debate and not let this screaming match between the extremes right now dominate the affair. I mean, the stakes are extremely high. I think many people do not realize how high the stakes are, and I'm truly concerned by this problem. It's most concerning in the United States here. Well, in the Europe you have the UK, where a predominant reaction seems to be, really, spy agencies spy? Isn't that what we're paid for? What they're paid for? I mean, of course, there are many people in the UK who are also concerned about intelligence operations, but nowhere near the intensity and the number that you find in this country. And then, of course, you also have a rather extreme reaction in other European countries, especially Germany, for historical reasons. But I would challenge many German policymakers, as well as activists, commentators, journalists, who challenge the Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post and Glenn Greenwald to moderate what I can only understand as self-righteousness on their part, and to a degree also naivete, and start thinking about the responsibility they have. I'll give you one example about what I mean here. The coverage that you read in the public arena, in the media, about the affair would lead you to believe that the NSA and other intelligence agencies are mainly targeting allies. They would lead you to believe that they're targeting international organizations like the UN and the EU. They would lead you to believe that they're targeting their own populations. And this is wrong. And the Guardian and the New York Times know that this is wrong. They do have more files that reveal this information to be wrong. In fact, the intelligence mission is concentrated on targets in Pakistan, Russia, as well, China, areas that are much more problematic. Now, of course, there's a degree of speculation on my part involved here, but only a degree. We have to have this debate, and we have to have it in a nuanced way. And in a way, this is more important than, my book and this discussion about cyber war, that whether it's happening or not. So I thought I make this little detour in my presentation today to provoke you a bit. Let me close by an argument that I actually have in the book. How long have I spoken until now? Is the half hour already over, or should I? Okay. So I'll give you that argument. I feel quite passionate about this other thing, so I didn't know how much time I just spent. If one question here in this wider debate, and this also pertains to the Snowden leaks, you may remember, some of you, that one of the documents that came out early in the leaks was Presidential Policy Directive 20, PDD 20. Is anybody here in the room who remembers reading about this document, PDD 20? It's a White House document. One person. Thank you. It's reassuring. This is one of the more important documents that was leaked, but it was not as sensational as some of the others. That's why it was drowned out. The White House seems has understood that offensive cyber operations, offensive capabilities, are more problematic than the debate is acknowledging, more problematic than many people in the Pentagon up to now. This is changing, have acknowledged. Why? Let me give you a brief example. The only most destructive, the most sophisticated computer attack that has ever happened in history was against Iran's nuclear enrichment program. You all know I'm assuming you have all heard of Stuxnet, this famous virus that sabotaged Iran's centrifuges. Stuxnet is interesting. Let's imagine Stuxnet in the shape of a rocket for a moment, okay? Just to give you, I'm using this as a metaphor. I understand the limitations of that comparison. At the fuel end of the rocket were generic components in the software that used Windows vulnerabilities. And for those who don't have a technical background, I apologize that I'm a little sounding a little bit geeky here. But they had generic vulnerability. They used generic vulnerabilities and exploits, as it's called, to breach into a system that could breach into a lot of systems in that weapon, if you like. And it actually did. It broke into about 100,000 machines, computers. Yours may have been one of those. Probably unlikely because you were not in Iran or Indonesia. For some reason, Indonesia was affected. But the rocket, if you like, had a sharp cone. And at the sharp cone was what engineers call a payload, and that was highly specifically targeted. The payload of Stuxnet was so specifically targeted that it knew the frequency at which these rotors inside those aluminum tubes that you can see here were spinning. They knew exactly, the piece of software knew exactly how the control environment that it was targeting looked like in terms of its fingerprint. So the engineers who built that sharp cone of the Stuxnet rocket, they needed to know the manufacturers of the frequency converters that the Natanz engineers used in order to overcome the frequency limitation of the Iranian grid, because the rotors it gets very technical very quickly. The point here is we have generic components of this weapon and highly specific components. So if your laptop was one of those laptops that was affected by Stuxnet, you didn't notice because Stuxnet couldn't do anything on your laptop. It was powerless. It could only execute the sharp cone, the payload, in the target system. And there was only one target system, which you can see on that picture. In other words, the hypothesis here is, question if you like, the question is, if you maximize the impact of weaponized computer code by developing this sharp cone that exactly knows its target, are you then minimizing the target set at the same time? Because it's so specifically bespoke and tailored for one target. Or put in a different way, can you develop a cyber weapon that you can shoot at more than one target? Because right now, on the basis of this experience, the assumption is that these are one-shot devices. It's like building a Tomahawk missile that can only hit one building. And once you did that, you can start from scratch. Now you may say, well, wait a minute. I'm only using the sharp cone, the payload. I can reuse the rest of the weapon and just, use a new sharp cone here. It's not that easy, because once you expose the generic code, vulnerabilities can be eliminated and patched, as computer security engineers call them. So there are a number of technical reasons that make it very hard to actually to use cyber weapons, if you want to call it that, to great effect. And this is one reason for this rather stunning statistic that I have from the Department of Homeland Security just a few weeks ago. The US Computer Emergency Response Team in charge of critical infrastructure protection, called ICS-CERT. It's a part of Idaho National Labs, where they're sitting in Idaho National Labs. They have never experienced a single successful act of computer sabotage against US critical infrastructure. Now, of course, we have experienced successful intelligence breaches. And I think your lab also has experienced one of those breaches a few years ago. Oak Ridge has experienced one. Los Alamos has experienced one. These are intelligence operations. It's a very different scenario. They can be generic. It's easier to penetrate targets. If you want to do damage inside the target, it's much more difficult. That's the argument that I'm making here. And let me close by saying something about the defense. Now, we talked about sharp cones and how they need target intelligence to be developed, which, by the way, limits the number of people who can develop such systems, such weapons, because engineering knowledge is widespread. You find that in many countries. But the target intelligence you need to build the system in order to penetrate a very specific target, that is not widespread. You need an intelligence service to do that. But the problem here is that developing Stuxnet, or developing another Stuxnet perhaps, On the offensive side, which may not be as expensive as building a new warplane, but it is a significant investment, doesn't do anything at all to make us safer on the defense. Because the defense and the offense in cyber operations, in cybersecurity, it's not that you can have a military unit that you may employ for defensive purposes, but also for offensive purposes. Here, in other words, a good offense is not the best defense. Because what is defense? Defense means that companies need to secure their networks. And who is in charge of companies? Not the government, but people who work at that company. Or it also means that individuals need to be self-conscious and aware of the risks. So sometimes I ask the question at the end of this presentation, how many people in the audience are using a so-called password manager? I'll explain what that is in a moment, but how many people are using a password manager? Yeah, maybe 3, 4, 5 usually. Password, so that means the rest of you are probably, quite certainly, reusing passwords. Maybe not exactly the same password. You may add a 1, 2, 3 at the end, or an exclamation mark or something like that, or a star, or you reverse the spelling or something like that. But you reuse passwords because we can't remember all these passwords, obviously. Using dictionary words in passwords makes them easy to crack. Variations makes them easy to crack. Using names makes them easy to crack. Dates makes them easy to crack. So password managers help you memorize passwords that are like 5-star, quotation mark, capital S, non-capital F, 7, whatever. You know, very complicated passwords that you cannot crack, but also cannot remember. That makes you much more secure against cyber war, yet nobody seems to be using that. I mean, a few people are. Things like that. My point is, and I'd like to end with that, talking about cyber war leads us to make a few assumptions that are flawed. One assumption is, 3 of them. One assumption is there's cyber war and there's cyber peace. Some people actually think that. It's nonsense. The problem is serious now, and we don't have to wait for cyber war. We need to do something now. Second assumption is that the government is in charge, or the military, or the NSA, because they're in charge of war, and of course they're in charge of cyber war. The Air Force seems to think that itself, strangely. In fact, that's also not the case because, as I said, everybody's in charge for their own systems. It's a little more complicated than that, of course. We can talk about regulation in the Q&A, or standards, etc. But the third point, again, I mentioned this already, is defense and offense have a very complex relationship here, and a good offense is not the best defense. I'll close with that, and perhaps we can go into more detail in the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, Thomas has challenged us and, as he said, provoked us. We'll open it to questions. Please identify yourself and your institution. Yes.
My name is Gabriel Wyman.
Wait 1 second.
Thank you, Thomas. My name is Gabriel Wyman. I'm currently, since 2 days now, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I study terrorism on the internet. And I have one comment, a very short one, and one question. The comment is that in your introduction, you said that the only attack, cyber attack that we know, was the attack on the Iranian computer system. However, you forgot to mention at least 2 cases that I will relate, and that was the first one, impressive one, was on Estonia, about 10 years ago, when Russian hackers, in a very well-organized way, operated a botnet attack, and actually shut down Estonia, the whole country, the media, the banks, the everything, government and so on. Now, you may say, well, that's not a war. So let me take you to the Russian attack on Georgia. That just before the attack, there was a computer attack on Georgia and shutting down the entire system. So we have many cases. But this is not the main point. My main argument has to do with your courage. It takes courage for a scientist to speak about the future. Because you make predictions that may turn out to be false. Most of us will never do doing that.
Yes.
You did.
No, I didn't.
Well, saying, this will never happen.
Yes.
Let me question the method and the philosophy behind this argument. What makes you so decisive about it?
Yeah.
First, time issue. We are 2013. What do you know how the net will look like in 2015?
Yes.
I must confess that I made the same mistake. In 2006, I was here in Washington, D.C., publishing my book, Terror on the Internet. Chapter 5 discusses, you probably know it, Thomas, cyber terrorism, actually arguing that we don't really know what cyber terrorism, we are exaggerating, and the media are using this fear of computers and terrorism combined to create some kind of media hype. But you know, in 2013, I'm not sure that I was right in 2006. So what makes you so sure about the future? You know what things look like now, but how will they look 2 years from now, 5 years from now, in a fast-changing environment like the internet? That has to do, let's say, with the time perspective. Let me go into the depths of the knowledge. How much do you know about those wars, hidden wars, and the agents involved in it? How much do you know about terrorists' plans to use cyber terrorism? How much will you know about the future to make you so decisive and say it will never happen?
Thank you for the question. It's easy. The question is easier than many of you may imagine for me to answer, because I'm actually not talking about the future. It's a title. The title is a pun on a French theater play, La guerre de Troie n'aura pas lieu. The Trojan War will not take place. And in fact, the spirit of the book is exactly the opposite of the title in that sense. The spirit is, let's not speculate. Let's not talk about the future. Let's look at the past. And I'm walking through all the cases that we have, including Estonia and Georgia. Let's look at the empirical evidence that we actually have. If we do that in Estonia or in Georgia, in those cases 2007 and 2008, what you find is, in both cases, the attacks that qualify as cyber attacks were denial of service attacks. A denial of service attack is an entirely generic attack. The only target intelligence that you need is a URL, a website. And we could do a denial of service attack right now. It would take us probably 90 seconds to download the software that can do that, and then we could try to attack a website. If it's a weak website, we may actually be able to take it down. Now, that's not really that scary. The longest time a single website went offline in Estonia was 90 minutes at a time. The attacks took 2 weeks, but on and off. I mean, the effect that we are observing here is actually quite interesting. Since Estonia, and since the denial of service attacks in Estonia, we have seen many denial of service attacks. Some of those were far more powerful in terms of the actual volume of requests and the data, and also the type of requests, the different types of DDoS requests that you can send to a server. But we are not that scared anymore. And I mean, I even discussed this with the Estonian president. Estonian officials, they understand that there was a learning effect. And if a big DDoS attack would again target Estonia, two things would happen. One is they would probably not succeed because Estonia has done a very good job in modernizing its infrastructure, its server infrastructure. And secondly, they would probably not that scared again, because it was the first time everybody was scared. Of course, you are scared. You don't know what happens. And that, I think, is the key element here. Many attacks in this space as well actually target our trust in a specific system. So you remember the AP hack when suddenly the Dow Jones dropped for just a few minutes, and then quite significantly, but just for, I don't know, what was it, 2 minutes or 10 minutes, I forget, but a short period of time. And then bounced back. That was because for a short moment, the collective trust was hit by this wrong AP tweet. But I think as these things are happening, we are beginning to we are getting used to the problem. We are developing new ways to deal with it, and I think it's less and less easier to shake our trust. But I mean, your point about cyber terrorism is still very well taken. I think the situation that we're having now is that those with the ability, with the capability to attack more seriously, not just taking down a website, but taking down a power plant, for instance. Those with the capability to do so do not have the will to do so. And those with the will to do so, you're terrorists if you like, do not have the capability to do so yet. They may have that capability at some point. But again, remember what I said about the sharp cone. You need target intelligence to do that. Terrorist militants, extremists may acquire the engineering knowledge. In fact, many of them, as you know, are engineers by training for some reason. But they don't have the target intelligence. So it's an interesting dynamic to watch.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Meg King. I'm Ms. Harmon's Chief of Staff here at the Wilson Center, and I care tremendously about cybersecurity. And actually, your comments echo Ms. Harmon about needing to have a public debate about some of the leaks and what it really means for us. So thank you for being here. I have two questions, specifically one on the encryption leak. A lot of people tout encryption as kind of one of the main ways to secure our emails and our use of the internet. To me, the revelation by Snowden kind of blew a hole through that, if some of them have backdoors. So I just wanted your comments on that. And then also to further your discussion about cyber terrorism, I wanted to ask your opinion about whether they could really buy exploits off the internet and use them crudely, or if that's still a ways away.
So the encryption revelations, I mean, the larger problem that we are seeing here is that governments, including their intelligence agencies, are using commercial off-the-shelf technology for encryption. They're using, they may not reveal what exactly they're using, but the products that you find in that space, in the national security space, may significantly overlap with the products that you find in a commercial space. Now, you want the NSA to be able to crack the encryption of high-value targets, but they may happen to use the same encryption than you, if you check your email. I'm making this up. I don't want to pick on any company. That's an interesting tension here, an interesting problem. How are we prepared to react to this problem as a society? Do we want the intelligence agencies to be able to distinguish after cracking a code? Or do we want to say to them, well, we don't really want you to do this in the first place? We haven't had that discussion. I suspect that most people, once they understand what's at stake, would take a nuanced approach and say, okay, some of these capabilities are necessary to have. That relates to a second problem. I'm told that the NSA internally used to have a rule or a question that they would ask in such situations. And the question was known as no bus. I think this is on the public domain. I'm not revealing anything that's not on the public domain. Otherwise, I wouldn't know it. The no bus question, nobody but us. Meaning, whenever they find an exploit, they have an exploit, some capability to crack encryption, for instance, and they ask, okay, can we expect anybody other than us to use that? If the answer is yes, then there's a huge incentive to make that public, that information, in order to fix the problem. If the answer is no, they may just go ahead and use it clandestinely. Now, the interesting question is, how does the no-bus rule or the no-bus question hold up over time? And the answer to that is that in more and more cases, the answer is, are we the only ones who know this and can use it? And the answer is no, there are others who can do it. That's a very serious problem, which means, and that is understood again in the intelligence community as well, that there may be an incentive to be more forward-leaning and public about vulnerability information. These are very important debates to have.
Yes.
This gentleman's first.
No, you first.
Go ahead, back in the back.
Robert Schroeder, international investor. Let me speak on behalf of the business community. One of the issues that's always blurred in these discussions is that it's often government agencies, whether they be U.S. or otherwise, who are acting perhaps in the best interest of defense, but often take offensive measures. Now, government agencies take offensive measures. Who knows what their calculations may be, because that's secretive in itself. But often the retribution comes back, and it's the private sector that pays. Disruption of business, disruption of consumer activity, disruption of citizens being able to communicate, let's say if there is an internet shutdown. So increasingly, I think you're going to see some anger building on the part of those who feel that they're in the position of having to answer for what their governments do, not just here in the US, but anywhere around the world. So when it comes to the real cost of this escalation in battle, if it's not a war, it's often the citizenry that pays the ultimate price. I wonder if you would care to comment on that.
Yeah. So what is the major problem for American companies here, and for any company that has a product that other companies are after, possibly interested in offering a competing product on the market? The major problem is intellectual property theft. Let's state that very clearly. The major problem is not some intelligence operation that may have the capability to crack an encryption mechanism that some company is using. That is not the major problem. We know the major problem is, that is a problem, and we should talk about it. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I'm saying it's not the major problem. The major problem is commercial espionage. And that's, we know this very well, which is ongoing and very serious. So, and that's mostly foreign commercial espionage against American companies. There are lots of breaches, as I'm sure you know. So what is at stake? A lot is at stake. But let me just challenge some of the conventional wisdom on commercial espionage. We are seeing, of course, we're seeing products copied and appearing on the market elsewhere. I think it's an open secret that Huawei, the Chinese hardware manufacturer in the telecommunication and routing business, has products that seem close enough to Cisco products to raise questions. I'm not an expert here, but that's what I'm told. But there are other products that are not easy to copy. And I think we need to be careful here. Where does knowledge reside in a company? Where does knowledge reside here in the Wilson Center? So it's a very strange company, but let's just make that example. It resides in human beings. It resides in our heads and in teams that cooperate. The same is true for Rolls-Royce or any company that produces a technically highly sophisticated product. You can't steal the engineer's brains, right? You only can steal what's on hard drives. And what's on hard drives may be very imperfect in order to replicate a product. So that's an interesting dynamic. What I'm trying to say here is, in the most serious cases of commercial espionage, you actually have oftentimes humans involved, not just technology. So just as a counterpoint to some assumptions out there.
James Sang, this is a follow-up actually. Trying to draw a line between cyber war and cybersecurity. Do we have any, well, I hate to use the word, but metrics for looking back from this point backwards, what the total, quote, value, and I don't know what I mean when I say value, of damage or something done via things like Stuxnet and the Estonia episode versus all the commercial stuff and all the random noise on the internet. I have the feeling that the war part is a tiny fraction of the security problem. And looking back, and I have a feeling looking forward, it's going to stay a very small part. And I'm curious what you think.
So the question, I mean, one question you're raising is what's the amount of the actual damage and the actual cost as a result of this?
Cost, what is what would be a good way of?
Yeah. So the answer is we are talking about a highly diverse problem set. I'm trying to offer a terminology to break this down. Sabotage, espionage, subversion, and crime. I haven't talked about crime today.
I'm talking including crime. Actually.
Yes, yeah. I gathered, that's why I mentioned this. So if you want to want to put a number on underneath all these columns here. What's the cost of computer crime, cybercrime? What's the cost of commercial espionage for a specific country, for instance? It's extremely hard to do. There are no clear numbers. That's because the uncertainty about what's actually going on is so big. I mean, the map that I'm showing here is a case in point. The map is showing control systems. These are not websites, right? These are systems that control traffic lights, elevators, power plants, water plants, the metro in DC, these kind of things that move fast and can burn or explode. So they're serious systems. These control systems should not be, in many cases, should not be connected to the internet. So this map shows publicly available data from a research project of control systems that are actually connected to the internet. Why am I mentioning this now in response to your question? Because it shows that we don't know how the map looks like. This is very imperfect, this map. It's not a perfect map, it's just a project at a university. We don't have that information. Nobody has that information. Not the NSA, not the Department of Energy, not Los Alamos, not AT&T. Nobody has a full overview of all ongoing exfiltrations, criminal, whatever, anything. So I would distrust any number that you hear. There is no correct number, because it also depends on what you include in computer crime.
Yes.
Thank you. Dieter Detke, Georgetown University, and here at the Wilson Center a couple of months ago. Thomas, can you give us a sense what you were talking about and what this means for individual privacy? You mentioned Germany and their concern about the NSA and all that, and it's a big concern. And the Germans have a law, call it a law, maybe or right, which talks about the informational self-determination.
Yeah.
And it's guaranteed by the German Constitutional Court. Now, what I'm hearing from you is there is no such thing as informational self-determination. Is that a correct conclusion? And what is your thinking about the issue and the consequences?
Who do you trust more, Facebook or the German government? I'm asking you, yeah. What's your answer? Who do you trust more? Seriously, who do you trust more?
Well, you can't trust anybody. I mean, isn't that the point?
Well, if we wouldn't trust anybody, does that include your bank?
Obviously.
So you don't trust your bank with your money?
They have to.
Well, fact is we have to trust each other all the time. I'm trusting my brother with a couple of things. I'm trusting my friend Jerry Muller, who's sitting here, with other things that are intimate to me. I'm trusting my bank with my money. I'm trusting Google for my email. We don't have the choice of having no trust. The idea that there's a trust-free world is entirely illusionary. It's laughable. So I would be a bit cautious and always ask for alternatives. So think about trust for a moment here. It's a very important point. You never trust somebody, period. You always trust somebody with something, especially when we talk about information. So would I trust Google? Would I trust Facebook with really intimate information? Certainly not, because their privacy policy is just an utter mess and ridiculous. Am I trusting the German government with other information? Well, as you say, I have to, but I'm also still a German citizen, so it's part of the social contract. We live in, there is a social contract. And just assuming that you can that national security is not part of the social contract, I think is just as naive as thinking there's no trust.
Rob.
Well, we're about to wrap up, but I just wanted to ask kind of a final 2 or 3 questions to sort of draw out some of your analysis. Michael Nacht at Berkeley, a scholar turned policy practitioner, was working in the Pentagon, and he was, I believe, like the first person assigned to being in charge of a kind of a cyber unit within the Department of Defense. And Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, just asked him a very straightforward question, which is, can you tell me, him talking to Michael Knott, what would be a contingency involving cyber for which the President of the United States would turn to the Secretary of Defense and say, we need to respond to this with the use of force? Okay? That's sort of one question. Michael really couldn't flesh out a good answer to that question. The second is your previous work has dealt with concepts like deterrence and you're in a war studies department. And I just wondered, are there any concepts that are from traditional kind of strategic studies that are useful in kind of dealing with this? For example, during the Libya intervention, there were press reports that the United States was hesitant to use cyber offensively against Libya because it didn't want to create a precedent of offensive use of cyber in kind of state-to-state conflict. In the nuclear area, a hot issue that you've addressed, you have a chapter on in your book, is on this question of attribution. And in the context of nuclear terrorism, attribution is a key issue in terms of like holding the country of origin accountable. And you have all similar kinds of problems of attribution, but it's even more complicated in the cyber world because of just how the proliferation, how the technology's proliferated. And in the nuclear area, people have questioned, could we, threaten retaliation against the country of origin of the nuclear material through nuclear forensics? And it's a very thorny question. And I say that as someone who doesn't use this password program and is among those who use family member names and pet names and variations with numbers and alphanumerics.
Don't say more than that.
Anyone who knows me can probably guess. You wouldn't have to go up to NSA headquarters to figure it out. Anyway, over to you, Thomas, for a kind of final comment.
Okay. So first question: what's the scenario that would trigger
a kinetic response.
A kinetic response. Well, there are scenarios. Richard Clarke is discussing some of those in his book, where a city would be shut down, or maybe even more than a city. Cyber attacks would shut down the electricity grid, public transportation, supermarket supply chains. Imagine it's summer, like the day before yesterday, no AC for days on end. I mean, that happened recently here also. Let's keep that a separate question. But yeah, well, if that happens, if it's actually a prolonged problem and not just for a day, we could probably approach a moment where a president would say, okay, we need to do something about this. Then the question is, do you know who did this to you? The answer is probably yes. Let's not kid ourselves. We would probably know who did that in such a situation, for a number of reasons. One also is because the intelligence community knows more about the attribution problem than people say publicly. But don't be concerned, really, because that scenario is not very realistic. I don't think right now that anybody, not even in the PLA headquarters, would be in a position to do that because the engineering challenge is massive. The unknowns involved are also extraordinary. I think instead of worrying about the black swan or the extremely unlikely event, we should rather deal with the problems that we already see today that are very serious. There are enough people who think in worst case scenarios. I think we need more people who think in terms of real solutions. The second question on deterrence.
Concepts from traditional strategic studies that have utility,
Yeah. I'm grateful for that question. Indeed, I did a long and very labor-intensive project on deterrence before that project. So it would have been natural for me to include a chapter on cyber deterrence. But I don't think right now this is very fruitful to do. I have yet to see an article, and I get sent lots of articles for review now, that makes sense on cyber deterrence. Why? Because really, I think the concept of deterrence that we developed in the Cold War makes assumptions that are highly, really unrealistic. So for instance, I don't think that deterrence is an absolute. It doesn't deter all offensive counter-reaction, only a good deal of it. That's the Israeli experience. That's our experience with domestic crime. You never deter all burglaries or all murders only 95%, or whatever figure. So maybe that can be applied to cyber security, I'm not sure. But this is a separate debate that I think we don't have the time for right now.
Please join me in thanking Thomas.